The following recording is from a presentation I gave at the Twin Cities Astrology Meetup yesterday. It's on the Sabian symbols and the progressed lunar phases. In the talk, I explain both of these concepts and basically how there is a different symbol for every degree of the zodiac. And we also, in our own lives, have a progressed new moon in our chart every 29 and a half years that lays the foundation for the arc of that 29.5-year period. You can work with these two things together and understand the theme that might be unfolding for you in your life when you have a progressed new moon. All of this is explained in the upcoming video. I use examples of a couple of clients as well as a much deeper example involving Martin Luther King's progressed new moon in 1954, and then his progressed new moon after his death in 1983, the year that Martin Luther King Day was established, and a lot of more information. So anyway, I hope you enjoy. If you do, like and subscribe. It helps people find my content. Thanks. So the impetus for this talk is I had a reading with Demetra George. She did my birth chart reading, which was amazing. She's a really pretty well-known astrologer who wrote like a 1,200-page treatise on astrology. She's about 80 now. Still got it going. And of all, I've had lots of readings, and hers was the best reading I've ever had, from somebody. In part because she grounded the reading in my progressed moon cycle. She started off talking about where I was in this particular cycle. And we're going to talk about what a progressed moon cycle is today. And it's basically this cycle, this 29-year cycle that can kind of tell you the background of what you're moving through over a particular period of your life. And after she did that, I started playing with my own clients' charts and doing that, but then I added my own spin, which is to bring in what's called the Sabian symbols. And I'm going to talk about what the Sabian symbols are, but there's a symbol for each degree of the zodiac. There's 360 different symbols that you can work with. So I started looking at the Sabian symbol associated with the progressed new moon. And I'll tell you what the progressed new moon is. It's the seed, like we're just talking about the new moon. So it's the seed for the 29-year cycle. I started looking at that and finding that it was very accurate for clients. I'll give you two examples, and then we'll use Martin Luther King's chart as a much more detailed example. But one is my friend Rebecca Larson, who is one of the leaders for this indivisible Twin Cities group. We met in 2017, right after the first Trump election, when we got involved politically and worked for many years together. But she was the person, one of the main speakers running the rally on April 5th, where they had like anywhere from 20 to 45,000 people. She was as surprised as I was, right? So all of a sudden she had been leading this little group and then it explodes. And then she does this rally. And I was looking at her chart, and her progressed new moon Sabian symbol is called a girl with a bugle. And it's the image of a girl with a rallying cry. I mean, it blew my mind. Yeah, and it's all about people.
I just got chills.
I know, no, and her progressed new moon was.
That is so cool.
Isn't that so cool? She's in the first quarter, or a little past the first quarter moon stage, which is when you begin to see what your call really begins to manifest. Okay, and then another one was a client I did who, I had done a reading for her sister. Her sister is a constant client of mine, and then this woman came to me as well. And the sister had been talking for years how she lives with her older sister. They're both unmarried, and they're both in, like, the younger one is maybe 70 and the older one's 80. And how they've had conflict, like this is part of what they're working through. And the new moon, the symbol for the sister, when I did her progressed new moon, the Sabian symbol was two spinsters living alone. And it has to do, I mean, it's kind of literal, but it has to do with, there's deeper images. It can have to do with a time of introspection and reflecting on your life and things like that. But so those blew me away. And then I decided to look more deeply at Martin Luther King's. And so we'll go through this presentation, and then it might not hit you right away. I looked at my Sabian symbol, and it's not something I necessarily wanted to be my Sabian symbol. It has to do with learning diplomacy, which I have Libra in the 12th house, and you can see who I am. It's not, but it is true for me. Like, it really has been the lesson that has blossomed for me since the new moon in 2015. Yeah, right? So anyway, so we can bring the image up for you, and I can send you a link with the image. If you're interested, and then you can reflect on it and send us an email back or come to the next meetup and talk if it feels like it resonated. It may or may not resonate with you. And so some of this is a little bit of my own research to try and figure out if this is really as potentially accurate or interesting as I think it is. But I do think it can take a little bit of self-reflection too, because sometimes we don't want to know, like the woman, we don't want to know that this is part of our fate necessarily, or that this is the karmic path that we're on in that moment. So we'll see what you think of this. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Okay, so the progressed moon cycle is 29.5 years long. And we talked already a little bit today about the different phases, and I've given this talk on the progressed moon cycle before, but I'll go through it sort of quickly again. You have a new moon, and then about, you divide the chart in 29.5 divided by 8 years, you're going to have, divided by 8, you're going to have your next phase, which is the crescent, right? The crescent moon happens a few years later, and then you have your first quarter moon around 7 or 8 years, and the gibbous moon, and then the full moon around 14 years from the new moon. And then you get to the disseminating and the last quarter and the balsamic. And all of those moon phases have a meaning. And I'm going to go over those meanings sort of quickly, right? And Demetra George, the woman I told you that gave me the reading, she's written many books, but one of her books she's got a couple of books, one for astrologers, one for lay people on the moon cycles. And if you can't find them and want me to send you a link, just email me when we're done and I'll find the references for you. So just big picture to orient everyone, we have our birth chart, which tells you who you are, your karma, the lens through which you see the world, your personality. It can tell you about your traits. It's not really who you are, because who we are is a lot deeper than these propensities that we all have, right? Just like you can be a short person, you can be somebody who gets angry easily. I got Mars ruling my chart. That's kind of, it's just like, that just happens to be the body that I was born into, right? So that's what the birth chart can show us, among a lot of other things. And then we have the transit charts, again, just to orient us. The birth chart is who we are. The transit chart is where the planets are in the sky at any given moment. That tells us, those planets are always moving and interacting with our birth chart. And that's how we get the different experiences of karma throughout our life. That's how astrologers are able to do predictive work for people, because we know where the planets are going to be and where they're going to be hitting your chart in the future. And so this is how we can say, you might have a really good experience in your partnerships next year. Or it could be a little rough, right? So that's where the energy or the ideas come from. And then we have the progressed chart, which is a symbolic chart that represents the evolution of your personality over time. And that's the 29.5 year cycle. And in that chart, they move the sun, your birth sun, forward 1 degree for every year of your life. And that's what the root of the progressed chart is. So you can tell if say your sun is at 29 degrees of Cancer. The next year, your progressed sun is going to be in Leo. And 30 years from then, your progressed sun is going to move again into the sign of Virgo. So that's just talking about where the progressed sun is in your chart. And even just having a shift of your progressed sun from one sign to another can mark a new period of your life. But you can add in there where the progressed moon is. The sun moves signs every 30 years. The moon moves signs every 2.5 years because it moves more quickly. Okay. And so we're talking about the relationship between these two lights. The sun and the moon are the lights in the sky that guide our way. We're talking about those relationships to understand the symbolic nature of, or to understand the evolution of your personality over time. You get a little bit more of a flavor for that when I go through this. Let me first go to these other slides so you get a feel for what I'm talking about. So you see in this first slide that the new moon happens when the sun and the moon are 45 degrees apart in the progressed chart. And a progressed chart is something an astrologer can bring up for you, right? I could show you. And then the crescent moon happens when they're 45 to 90 degrees apart from each other. The moon has moved forward more than 45 degrees. And I'll send you a copy of these slides as well. And the first quarter moon, 90 to 135, the gibbous, 135 to 180, and so on. Okay, and then we have the next ones as well. You'll receive these slides. And so all of these different phases have different symbolic meanings. And Dane Rudhyar wrote one of the seminal books on these phases of the moon and the sun. And some of what you learn here, you can apply to the new moon and full moon in everyday life, but now we're applying it to this symbolic chart, right? So every 2 weeks we have either a new moon or a full moon, right? And those unfold in a cycle. So you'll have a first quarter moon and that has an energy, right? But now we're applying it to this bigger arc of our life. And so you have the new moon, which is, you can read the detail underneath this when I send the slides, just for sake of time. But the new moon is the seed planted in the ground. People with a new moon in their birth chart, right? Because you can also look at the phase in your own birth chart, are people who tend to intuit their way. It's like the seed in the ground that has to feel its way to break through the earth. They can have a very intuitive quality. People with a first quarter moon, like me, it's called crisis in action. It's when that plant is getting ready. It's building the structures it needs to support and bring forth abundance in the world, that full moon energy. So it's this turning point where you're like the teenager trying to break free and make something on your own, but there's a certain amount of energy that it takes to do that. So people with the first quarter moon tend to jump in and maybe try and take action or do something new. Right? There's this constant, that teenage energy of I want to be who I am. So that can be the energy of a first quarter moon in a birth chart, but it can also be the energy we're going to see with Martin Luther King, can also be the energy in the progressed moon phase cycle where you're doing that out in the world around the seed that you planted. And then just very simply, the full moon is when the fruit is on the tree, ready to be picked. People with a full moon in their birth chart, like Taylor Swift, the musician, tend to be very prolific, or can be somebody who puts a lot of stuff out in the world, depending on where the moon and sun are, right? If they're in houses that are a little less productive, it might not be that they're selling or producing things in the world. It could be that their productivity has to do with something behind the scenes, right? So it's complex. So this is some of the flavor of, you can see they all have a different symbolic meaning, all the different moments in the cycle. You have a question there, Deborah? No, okay. And I'm going over this quickly so we can get to the meat and then also look at your charts so that if you want to know what your Sabian symbol is. So these are just the diagrams again of the moons. And then let's weave in this Sabian symbol idea, right? I'm missing, I'll add to this slide. I had a link. So I'm just gonna make a note really quick to add my link in. These are two of the books that people can sometimes use to understand those Sabian symbols, those 360 degrees of the zodiac. But there's also a website by James Burgess that fleshes out some of the meaning and has images with it. We'll see some of the images as I talk about Martin Luther King's Sabian symbols. And that website you'll want to look at. Now, you always, with anybody I read or study, I put my own spin on it. I don't swallow it whole, right? If there's things that you don't agree with about how they phrase things, you can always take what fits and what you trust intellectually and reject what you don't. James Burgess's site, I like it. He does some videos, but I also find him a little bit over the top at times. So that's just my imprimatur. And Nicole and I were talking, and I have not read, I have the first book by Mark Edmund Jones, but I didn't love it. So I haven't read it really deeply. And that's what Nicole said when we were talking. She didn't love it. Dane Rudyard's book, you're going to see the descriptions are a little bit vague at times. And the same with Mark Edmund Jones, and that's one of the reasons why you might go to this website with James Burgess, because he fleshes it out more and it just feels a little bit more set for modern times.
Yeah, more set for modern times. The Mark Edmund Jones he really does fly. He gives a lot of detail in there, but it's so archaic that it's like it's walking through mud. Like, yeah, it's just.
Yeah, it was 1925 when they downloaded, and we're going to see that some of the descriptions they use, like one of the ones, a little racist because it's outdated. So again, that's the idea of needing to take it or understand the cultural context in which some of the descriptions, or in which Elsie Wheeler, I think her name was, this psychic downloaded these images. But, and also, I would say, whenever I've worked with the Sabian symbols, not just for this purpose, but you could look at where the sun is in your chart, where the moon is. It's always felt really dead on for me. So I found them to be helpful. So if we're going to combine the Sabian symbols with the progressed lunar cycle, what you do is you find out, this is from my astrology program, you can get a list of the progressed lunar cycles in somebody's chart. And it's gonna list the degree where the last new moon was. We see Martin Luther King had a new moon on January 14th, 1954, at 20 Aquarius. Yeah. And then he had another new moon posthumously that we're going to talk about that happened in August 25th, 1983. That happened to be the year that they decided to make Martin Luther King Day a holiday, right? So this is super interesting that our charts continue after we die. I know, I'm getting goosebumps again. So one thing to know about Sabian symbols is the Sabian symbol for 20 Aquarius is called Aquarius 21. Okay, they go to the next degree. And if you look at the website for James Burgess, he always says Aquarius 21, and then parentheses, it'll say 20-21 degrees Aquarius, just so you know. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then let's look at Martin Luther King's two charts with the progressed new moon. The first one here is the one in Aquarius in 1954, and the next one is in Pisces in 1983. Those are the two Sabian symbols we're going to look at. So Aquarius 21, this is the symbol. A disappointed and disillusioned woman courageously faces a seemingly empty life. This symbol emphasizes the theme of inner reorientation and spiritual resilience. It represents a moment when one must confront the emotional aftermath of shattered illusions, but also implies an opportunity for courage and renewal. The individual is encouraged to face the future with determination, even when it appears bleak and uncertain. One thing I'll add is that for Martin Luther King, Aquarius is his 10th house. The 10th house has to do with career, okay? What we do out in the world. And so knowing that you're having a progressed new moon in your 10th house for the next 29 years, you know that the focus of your life, if it's in the 10th house, is going to be around career. If your progressed new moon is in the 5th house of creativity and children, that might be the underlying theme, right? So we can not just look at the Sabian symbol, but we can also look at the house that it's in. Okay, so for Martin Luther King, we're going to know the next 29 years has to do with what he does out in the world, and then the 29 years after that is going to have to do with 11th house topics, which has to do with the greater collective. And this is when Martin Luther King Day was named, right? Is this next new moon. Okay. So in 1954, right after this progressed new moon, he became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, marking the beginning of his prominent leadership in the civil rights movement. This new moon, symbolized by the disillusionment and courage of the Sabian symbol, suggests a fresh cycle in his life where he would face immense challenges, including the systemic racism and resistance to equality in America. We can also just know that Aquarius, the sign, has to do with the collective in general. It's a sign that has to do with being a humanitarian over being concerned about humanity individually or people individually. It has to do with big visions of the structures and new ideas that you'd like to bring into the world. The symbol reflects the disillusionment King and many others faced as they confronted the harsh realities of racial injustice in the United States. The phrase courageously faces a seemingly empty future points to the daunting task of fighting entrenched societal structures where the future of racial equality seemed almost unattainable. King's rising role in the movement required him to overcome emotional and spiritual challenges while inspiring others to persevere despite the immense obstacles. At the very beginning of this time is when the Montgomery bus boycott happened, right? And I'm just gonna skip over this because you can read some of the slides. So that's the beginning, right? Is he's starting to become a leader. And then at the first quarter moon is the I Have a Dream speech, right? Wow. It's this pivotal turning point. I know, it just, yeah, isn't that very cool? I just love it. The first quarter moon phase represents crisis in action, as I said, when challenges arise that test the ability to manifest the vision initiated during the new moon phase. It's a time of bold action, mobilization, and confronting obstacles. The first quarter moon is about tension between the old and the new, requiring decisive action to overcome resistance and inertia. For King, this manifested as the need to galvanize the nation to address racism and inequality head on. The Sabian symbol's themes of courage in the face of disillusionment are echoed here as King called upon the nation to rise above its failures and embrace a vision of justice, equality, and unity. So it's this turning point, right? When the seeds planted during the new moon phase begin to sprout into visible action. Okay. And then we get to his progressed full moon, and that's when he was assassinated. And what I found interesting and really had to think about, because I was reading that full moons involve sacrifice. I mean, it's not like, it feels a little icky, right? To say that his death was a sacrifice or that this was somehow built into the, his karma or whatever, right? Because it's awful that he was assassinated for his act, right? So I'm just going to read this piece. Full moon symbolize illumination, fulfillment, and culmination, but also the potential for sacrifice in service of the greater good. And we get some of these ideas of sacrifice and release at the full moon from three different authors, Dane Rudyard, Stephen Forrest, and Alice Bailey, right? Where they talk about this. Rudyard describes the full moon as a time of fulfillment, but also a moment of crisis and decision where one must release what no longer contributes to growth. He emphasizes the spiritual and psychological sacrifices required during critical lunar phases. Stephen Forrest links the progressed moon phases to psychological and spiritual development. He discusses the full moon as a time of culmination and necessary release. And Bailey, in her works, associates the full moon with heightened spiritual awareness and the need to sacrifice the lower self for the greater good or soul purpose. And so you've reached this culmination point, and then the rest is letting go of that, of what you've reached, right? Do you have anything to add, Nicole?
No.
Okay, it just looked like you had something going on.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'm at that space right now. Like
yeah.
finishing that full phase, and so it's interesting because I've definitely been meditating on. I didn't actually know this. I have not done this, but like honestly, in my own life, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of. It's also in my 8th house, so it's definitely a lot of loss. But
yeah. Double. Yeah. And so this is just a little overview of where he had gotten to this point, right? After the I Have a Dream speech, he actually ran into a fair amount of difficulty, kickback, because people had different ideas about liberation and his involvement in protest around the Vietnam War and whatnot. So he was running into some real difficulty, difficult times at that point, at the moment of his assassination, but he persevered, which is really built into this new moon energy that has to do with continuing, or somebody who's facing a great struggle to change something, right? And when we get to the sacrifice piece too, I realized he was very well aware that his life was in danger at the moment of his assassination. So this is a quote, I believe, from the night before, if not the speech itself, where he was like, okay, this is, I'm going to keep doing what I need to do and step into it. Yeah. And then this slide summarizes the arc of this lunar cycle from the new moon to the full moon. And again, I'm just going to let you, I'll send the slides out and you can read that later, because I feel like we've gotten that and I want to make sure we have time to chat about people. But I do want to then just quickly talk about his posthumous, progressed or posthumous, progressed new moon on August 25th, 1983. You see there, it's in Pisces. And 2 days after that was the 20th anniversary march, which was huge. And then in November, a few months later, Martin Luther King Day was established. So his progressed new moon after he died was at 21 degrees Pisces. And it's called Under the Watchful and Kind Eye of a Chinese Servant, with a little asterisk noting how racist that is. A girl fondles a little white lamb. So this idea of this new moon in his 11th house of the collective is around service, right? Being recognized for service, the tenderness of Pisces, the empathy, the softness of that energy, right? This degree invites humility, compassion, and the pursuit of higher ideals through collaboration and mutual care. So we could also wonder about his legacy, because I certainly am living that legacy, right? How he acted. So this is just, he's kind of personal to me. I didn't know it, but he was a philosopher. He had a doctorate in philosophy, and he studied this philosopher, Martin Heidegger. I studied for years, a really complex philosopher, and all of his work is grounded in this idea of not just nonviolence, but the connectedness of human beings to each other and love.
What's his name?
Martin Heidegger.
Martin Heidegger.
Martin Heidegger. He wrote Being and Time. And so I think a lot of folks don't, because he had this capacity to speak in a way that the common folks understood. A lot of people did not know the depth of his intellectual knowledge, and that all of his theories and all of his speeches were grounded in something much larger and deeper. Yeah. Anyway.
Another thing, can I point one thing
Yeah,
out
go
about
ahead.
this? The thing that I find most interesting about this is that we think of Martin Luther King as being all about nonviolence, but the reality of it was that he preferred nonviolence, but he was not opposed to violence. But when we look back on him, this is the way that we see him. And it's interesting because we talk about this kind eye of a servant fondling a little lamb, which obviously is like the gentlest thing. This is how we see him, but that's not fully who he was. Once again, he was not opposed to violence. He just preferred to not use violence.
Well, and it is, I think what he preferred actually is to expose the reality of the violent nature of the system by using nonviolent methods.
Right.
So when somebody embodies and demands what is their right, it's gonna bring violence down, and it's gonna expose the reality of the violent control of the state, right?
But he was also not opposed to violence. Like, he would have, yeah, we can talk about
That's
that.
okay.
But
Yeah.
but he was not as non-violent as we think that he was. And
Okay.
we have put that narrative out there.
Yeah.
But the real story.
But the real story is that he was not opposed to it. And, I think the movement, obviously Malcolm X picked it up and that turned to be a lot more violent, a lot more violence. But King probably would have gotten there too, but obviously.
Yeah, I would love to,
down.
I'd love to hear more. I'd love for you to send me something of his that talks about that, because I'd like to learn more. And that is fair, I mean, that is, so if we think about his legacy, it really has been to be identified like Mahatma Gandhi with nonviolent protest.
Right. We've done that contrast too, right? Because we have Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we kind of look at them as a contrast of violence versus nonviolence, activism. And so, but it's interesting that this really does kind of show that push towards, because once again, we're talking symbolism here.
Right, yeah.
And so this is how we see him. That doesn't always mean that that's accurate, how we see people.
Yeah.
It's just the image that's projected onto them.
Yeah. And so then here we just have some images from those two dates. Yeah. And then this is a summary of how that applies to his life, but I'm more than willing to change it up and add in what you had to say, what you were saying, Nicole, because I'm curious now about what the reality was, if I've missed something. Yeah. So, but I'm going to go ahead and read this part. The progressive new moon at 21 Pisces symbolizes renewal through unity, service, and interconnectedness, themes deeply tied to the Sabian symbol. This symbol reflects innocence, hope, and the selfless contributions of diverse individuals working toward a greater good. The 20th anniversary of the March on Washington embodied these ideals as people from all walks of life united to honor Martin Luther King's dream and renew the fight for justice. And then as well, the creation of Martin Luther King Day the same year further echoed the symbol's message of service and harmony across differences. And I think that's the last slide. Okay, let me just stop the recording.